Welcome back. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show as a guest Dr. Adam Drummond. And Dr. Drummond has lots of different experiences in education and educational leadership as an educator, a former award-winning administrator, and the current associate partner and author for the International Center for Leadership in Education. Dr. Drummond, thank you so much for joining me here. We had some scheduling issues, but I'm really glad to have you now, and it's a pleasure to talk to you. Before we really get going, if you could just, finish that introduction and fill people in on what it is you do and where you're from and all that.
Sure, thanks. And it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and glad we were able to make the connection happen. Most importantly, I think the titles that I carry closest to my heart are father and husband. So I live in Northeast Indiana with my wife, Tiffany, who is a high school career and technical education administrator. And then we have 3 children. My oldest son, Chase, is 16. My middle son, Carson, is 11. And then our daughter, Carter, is 6. So we keep very busy with our kiddos about 10 years apart. My wife as a high school administrator. So as you mentioned, I work as an associate partner at the International Center for Leadership and Education, which means I spend my days partnering with schools and districts across the country as we look at ways in which that we can build collective teacher efficacy in districts and work to boost student academic achievement and growth. Prior to that, was an administrator. Worked both at the building level and then the district level in professional learning, elementary and middle school teacher, and then I currently teach adjunct at Ball State University and the Department of Educational Leadership. So have kind of a pre-K through college experience that certainly lends itself to really great opportunities for collaboration with schools and districts across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite the background. You have a lot of experience all throughout the many grades of education from, like you said, I think third grade on up to higher ed. Um, this show is all about being a leader of learning and leading label-less leadership, right? Leading no matter what your role or your title. I'm curious, having held so many different titles and roles throughout education, I love asking this of people. Was there a moment where you kind of realized that you were that leader of learning? Was it maybe while you were a classroom teacher or as you started as an administrator where you were like, this is where I'm supposed to be in terms of how I can really impact and affect what I'm trying to do here in the education space?
Yeah, I think I've had that opportunity really many times, right? As a classroom teacher, you've envisioned what that's going to look like, and I vividly remember my first classroom at Salamone School in third grade when my third grade students walked in, and it was that moment I have the opportunity to impact these children's lives. And now looking back 20 years later, seeing them as adults and having their own kids, and knowing that I played a small part in the footprint of their life, I think that's an opportunity. Of course, when you work at the district level and you're supporting teachers and their pursuit of helping kids, there's a different type of feeling that you're making a difference. And of course, at the building level as a school leader, you have that. And then, I even think now being able to partner with districts across the country, I've had the opportunity to work in Native American reservations on the islands of Hawaii, Florida, Brooklyn, New York, and in each of those opportunities, is an opportunity to learn. And I think in many cases, I learned so much about who I am as a leader as I'm partnering with those individuals. So I think if your eyes are open and your heart's willing, every day is an opportunity to see what does learning look like and how do we embrace that. And I think it's our responsibility, moral obligation to be better than we were the day before yesterday, which means we need to learn and be open to lifelong learning.
I love what you just said about learning and growing each day to be better tomorrow than you were today. And I also think the same thing goes for being better one school year to the next. And we were just talking before we hit record even, and I wanted to bring it up during the interview about, we're getting close to the end of the year. So some schools actually, depending on where you live, may have already ended. But as we wrap up this school year, which has been one of the two, in my opinion, most difficult years in education. Of course, last school year, as we all shifted to remote learning, and this year whatever school looked like, clearly was really difficult. But now probably gonna face some new challenges even as we head into planning, preparing, and entering next school year. So looking at it, I guess, from the lens of the school's culture, as leaders, really, no matter whether it's in an administrative role or not, what are we thinking about? What are we doing to, be proactive about what school might look like in the near future?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, for our listeners that are joining us, thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done over the last 18 months. Never in history have we had a global pandemic that has translated and transformed education. We will go back in the fall with a new type of education, new type of teaching and learning. We don't have the opportunity to go back and do the way things were. And quite frankly, there were things that happened that I think were even better than before the global pandemic, right? There were ways that we were able to have kids create and analyze and synthesize in ways that we've never had. There were certainly many, many challenges and hardships. As I share, my wife's a high school CTE director, and in talking with the number of students who have been virtual, and those students who maybe don't have enough credits because they didn't do enough of the coursework, and what are those challenges that exist. And so there are certainly some hardships that happened this year for our students, and then, of course, for families and teachers and leaders. So I think, if nothing else, to making sure that you know how much you're appreciated is really important as we think about culture. I think the other piece is culture doesn't rest with the leader. Culture rests with every person in the building. And so, as we have now, in the month of June and looking at the summer, this is a great opportunity for us to really reflect and think back about what are the changes that happened, and what's the culture that we want to have when we come back into the fall. I think one thing that we know for sure is that staff and students alike experience primary, secondary trauma of some sort. Many, not all, but many. And some of those we don't know, and some of those we won't know. And so I think at the heart of what we do when we come back is making sure that we have compassion at the forefront of everything that we do. We need to spend time next year with people and making sure we understand everyone's stories. We talk about the importance of relationships at the beginning of the year, making sure we're making those connections. And I think coming back into the fall, it's even more critical that we spend time getting to know one another, making sure that we have space built in for our students to know one another, that they get to know the adults in our buildings, and that we're really leading with compassion. We know, kids don't learn from people they don't like. And I think even more so for some of our students who have been virtual for 18 months coming back in the fall, if they choose to do so, is going to be a hurdle. And they're having to move back into a school setting that they've not seen for almost 2 years. And so we need to have the grace and the compassion that comes along with that. And I think we have to have compassion and grace for ourselves. This does give us a fresh start of a new school year. And so we need to take what we've learned, grow where we've grown, and make sure that we're starting with compassion.
I love so much of what you said. You keep bringing up the word compassion, and thanking the educators who are listening for doing the job that they have done for really the better part of the last year and a half. Um, as a building leader, I guess I'm specifically talking about people who oversee staff members and educators who are doing that work. Um, how, I guess, if you can maybe be a little more specific and throw out some ideas, how can you acknowledge and thank teachers for what they've done while still, moving ahead and moving forward, and I guess really maintaining that momentum then moving into next school year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's lots of ways in which we can start to think about how do we honor and recognize the work, and really get a handle on where do we feel like the culture is. And I think something that I write about in my book is 30 minutes, a strategy. It's called 30-minute visits, where you sit down with a teacher for 30 minutes, and it's non-evaluative, right? I think we've gotten into this evaluation cycle that the only time we talk with teachers is when we're doing their pre-conference, their during conference, post-conference, walk through data. But really spending time with each staff member, and really spending 30 minutes and ask about what's worked well last year. What did you love? What didn't you love? What are your goals for this coming year, and how can I support you? Asking those three questions, what went well and why, what are your goals and how can I support you? And meeting with every staff member and doing that, and then letting those open-ended questions drive the conversation, just like we're doing right now, right? Like we have some general questions, and we're just having a conversation around the needs and how do we build that culture. And I think that's time well spent for any leader. And it doesn't matter if you're brand new to being a principal, or you're brand new to your school, or you're a 10, 15-year veteran administrator. We need to spend time in talking with one another, and for you to really listen as a leader. I think sometimes we can get caught up in having to solve the problems for everyone as a leader, and we don't spend enough time listening and really engaging in that. And so I think that's one strategy. I also think, obviously surveying your staff, and doing some anonymous surveying. There's mixed opinions on anonymous surveys. People feel like if I do an anonymous survey, they can say whatever they want. And the reason you want to do it as anonymous surveys, you can say whatever you want, right? So I think giving the flexibility and you understanding that, if you do an anonymous survey, that there'll be things in there that you don't like. And I think you have to know that going in. But then looking behind the why, right? If somebody says something in an anonymous survey, there's a reason why that was said. And I always tell folks, if you're going to do an anonymous survey, that's fine, but you need to follow up with focus groups. And so once you've done your anonymous survey, find 3 things that you want to dig into more deeply and schedule a round of focus groups, and dig into those questions a little bit more to find the why behind those. So I think those are 2 strategies. I think that those are important for us to think about. I also think it's a great opportunity as you're coming back at the end of the year in June, or when school starts in the fall, to do a profile of a classroom, right? So right now across the country, you're seeing lots of things around profile of a graduate. What do we want to see in our graduates? The World Economic Forum said these are the skills we need by 2020. I would say, let's talk about a portrait of a classroom. What are the behaviors and characteristics that we want to see in classrooms? And how do we make sure that we can help them be successful? And so I think that identifying that and having folks spend time in collaboration is a really powerful professional learning session where we can design, this is what teaching and learning looks like in our classrooms at our schools.
So much of what I heard you say throughout that entire answer was, to me, in my interpretation and what I take away from it, is just listening, being there for those around you, whether they are staff members who you are supervising, or whether it's just colleagues among the staff. Just really listening and learning from one another through feedback, through dialogue, through those collaborative kind of conversations and opportunities to come together. And I definitely think that's really important. I did want to acknowledge, because you hit on it, and I neglected to mention it in your introduction, your book, the Instructional Change Agent. And I've done this a couple of times on podcast interviews in the past, and I'll set this up a little bit by saying that last fall, when presidential debates were happening, I can't remember which news reporter or anchor asked this question, but it was a great question about whether someone should be considered a change agent or a disruptor. And I've asked guests that, and I'm thinking, because you wrote a book called The Instructional Change Agent, you'd probably say that you or strong educational leaders are change agents. So I guess my question to you is, do how would you interpret the difference between a change agent and a disruptor, if there is one?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I hadn't thought about that before. I think, to me, right off the cuff, I don't know that I necessarily know a difference, right? Like a disruptive thinker, I think visually when you see that, like if somebody's being disruptive, they're coming in and they're just blowing things up, right? And things look different. And I think, a global pandemic disrupts things, right? Like it blew up how we do teaching and learning, and working with families and the modalities and those pieces. And when I think about a change agent, it's this idea as a leader. I've been hired to come in, and I don't have to bring about change per se, but there are very few. Let me step back in that. There are very few leaders that get hired that say, man, things are going really well, Adam. I just want you to come in and coast. I just want you to come in and just keep it going the same. Like that typically doesn't happen, right? Like you're brought in because you have ideas and you have visions. And as a change agent, it's how do I bring everybody together to facilitate this process? And to me, as a change agent, it's about how do I build this inclusivity and making change happen. And so I think that in some ways they can be interchangeable. I think it's the approach in which you take, right? Disruption is kind of this really powerful visual of what it looks like. And I feel like change agent is this more methodical approach in how do we create long-term sustainable change.
Yeah, I hear you. I think disruption is more threatening. You know, I think there are similarities. I just think that to me, change agent sounds like it's more of an ongoing process, something that requires probably more thought, being more cerebral about the process of change. But I like the term. I like both terms. I guess I lean more toward the instructional change agent. Now, in the book, you offer 48, which seems like a lot, but I'm sure you probably could have mentioned even more. 48 practical ways to support you, the school leader or the instructional change agent, if you will, in your day to day leadership. You don't have to list all 48, of course, but what are some of those
Good.
strategies? Those, yeah, I really put you on the spot.
Yeah.
No, but what are some of the biggies? What are some of the more
Yeah.
important ones that you think would be great to mention to those leaders who are listening?
Yeah, so I think folks who have seen the book recognize that it's not something you have to read to cover, all in one setting, right? It's broken into four parts around culture, instructional planning, learner engagement, community partnerships, advocacy. And so for me, the reason I wrote the book is I wanted folks to have ways in which they can make change tomorrow. So if I'm really struggling with, my future culture and what do I want that to look like, I can go to chapter 5 and here's 3 ways or 3 ideas that I can start to impact the culture for the future. Or I'm really focused around how do I market my school, right? So that we're giving the narrative, because if I don't tell my story, somebody else will, right? So you can go to the fourth part of the book and you can find that. And so it's meant to be this resource that you can pull out, put away, easy to use, and so there's several ways in there. Obviously I like them all. That's why they're there. But ones that I think resonate with me the most, there's one in chapter 5 around the future leadership about knowing your five. And I really push and question superintendents, principals, even teachers. Where do you see your role 5 years from now, right? So as a superintendent, where do you want to see your school district in 5 years? What do you want students to be doing in your classrooms 5 years from now? What do you want parents to be saying about your school? What do you want to see your community involved with in your school? And when folks hear 5 years, they're like, wow, that's a long time from now. But in many ways, it's not. And I think as leaders, especially principals and superintendents, we aren't hired to lead today. We're hired to bring in tomorrow. And so as leaders, we have to be thinking, what does it look like 5 years from now? And when I know this is the vision of 2026, how do I backwards plan? What do I need to do to strategically put myself in a position to be successful? So for me, that's one that I really, really like. One that is around student engagement. In this one, I give full credit to my counselor from when I was a principal, Nicole Harner, and it's called I think it's 3 minutes, minute meetings with students. And essentially, you go and you meet with every student for 3 minutes and you ask 3 open-ended questions. And the questions are designed based on what you see happening in the school. And so when Nicole came to my school, she did this just to get to know the culture, get to know what students are worried about. So, what's something you love about school? What's something you wish you could change? And what's something that you really, really like about learning? So here's 3 questions. She literally spent the first 6 weeks and talked to every single student in my building. And she just kept a Google form, right? And just kept giving the notes. And now she has this wonderful qualitative data that she could go and plan lessons and look for focus groups and student groups. And I thought, what a powerful way to really get a good handle on your culture and what instruction looks like. And so that's one that I think is so important. We can often forget that schools were created for students, not for adults. And so we have to make sure that we're really focused on what do we want to see from our students. And the best way to ask how they learn is to ask how they learn and take that information and know that you're going to do something with it. When we look at community, one that's in there is hosting a community walkthrough. And so this is a strategic process where you bring in 12 to 15 community leaders. Doesn't have to be just parents, businesses, non-for-profits, and you basically open your school for a morning, and you have them give you feedback from the moment you came onto our campus. How did you feel about welcoming? Was it a friendly environment? What did you see in classrooms? Look at our print materials or our social media materials. What do you see? What do you like about it? What are things that we could go through and make changes? How do we become more family friendly or more inclusive of our community? And then you sit back again and you take in all this information, and then you look to make change. I think whether you're surveying, whether you're doing the focus groups, whether you're doing minute meetings with students or the community walkthrough, the data is as good as you do something with it. So we need to report back out. So if I'm going to do these minute meetings, or I'm going to do this 5-year vision planning or the community walkthrough, I need to close that loop and then come back out and communicate what's changed as a result of this. And I think that's one of the most important pieces throughout the 48 ways you're going to see. It tells you the who, what, when, where, and then what, right? So that's the part that's, so what do I do? What's the next step? And I think we often forget that. We go through and do the task, and then we move on to the next thing. But what's the implication? And I think that's the power that the 48 ways have in the book.
That's great. As I shoo a fly away from me. No, that's really great. And one of the things you said really stuck out to me, which is like, you're not just leading for today, you're leading for 5 years from now. I'm putting words in your mouth. I know you didn't say it exactly like that, but that's really great. And again, throughout that answer, a lot of what I heard was really listening. Listening to your staff and your students, understanding that we're really here for the students, but also listening to community members. But taking it a step further to not just listen, but actually do something. Act upon the data that you collect, the feedback that you get. And I think a lot about follow through, whether it's in education in general, teaching, certainly leading. What is it that you're acting upon when it comes to your thoughts and ideas, your planning? So I really love that idea of really thinking 5 years out. Of course, the link to Dr. Drummond's book will be in the show notes. Hopefully, people will pick up a copy and learn how to be more of an instructional change agent. And again, you don't have to read all 48 ways in one shot, but I'm looking forward to reading it. I think it's some good stuff based on what you've already told us. Um, of course, as we wrap up, I want to thank you for your time tonight. And again, glad to make the connection after a couple of missed opportunities. What other advice might you be able to give my listeners and the school leaders out there? Again, labelless leadership. No matter what your role is, what your title is, you're a leader if you're in a school building or you're in some sort of position to affect change in education. What else do you have for us as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I would tell any educator right now is to breathe. Take the moment. We've been on a roller coaster. It's felt like a sprint, like you're sprinting a marathon, and I think it's okay to take some time and breathe, and make sure that you are well. You know, hurt people, right? And that means lots of different things. And so I think for us to be our best for our kids, we have to be our best for ourselves first. And so that means taking time, and whether that's going for a walk every day, or drinking enough water, getting your 10,000 steps, reading a book for 15 minutes, journaling, going to a yoga class, talking on the phone with friends, but making sure that you're putting that time in for you to breathe, that you're not taking the title and labeling that as who you are, right? Like if I could go back and tell my old self as a principal, is to say, Adam, you should have been Adam first, principal second, and not let the title of who you are become who you are. And so I think as educators, we often feel like we're in that rat race where we do have to live our title every moment of every day. And if we're not well, we're not going to be able to be well for our kids. So the best piece of advice I have for folks is to breathe.
So much great stuff right there. Again, thank you for your time. And again, listeners, links to Adam's book and contact information, of course, in the show notes. But Adam, if you could just let everybody know how they can connect with you and get more information if necessary, I'd appreciate that.
For sure. So my Twitter handle is Adam D Drummond. And so you can find me there on Twitter. You can also go to leadered.com. And that's our site at ICLE. And you can connect with me there. And then I do have my own website, adamddrummond.com. So 3 different ways there. Certainly, if there's questions, things that you need, let me know. Happy to help, support, and assist. And just again, I started this way and end this way. Thank you for what you're doing. You are changing the trajectory of lives. You're impacting 3 generations. You're impacting your students. You're impacting your students' parents, and you're impacting your students' future children by what you do today. So thank you for all that you do for your kiddos and for our communities across the country, across the world.